So the lower two quadrants really affect kind of my day-to-day experience of work. And you can't put a dollar figure on them. And yet they are critical to why people come to organizations and why they stay at organizations.
Welcome to Culture Change RX, the podcast for healthcare professionals that are committed to creating a thriving workplace culture, improving the experiences of employees and patients, and ultimately unlocking their organization's next level of potential. I'm Sue Tetzlaff, your host and co-founder of Capstone Leadership Solutions. Join me and my insightful guests each week as we share actionable insights for navigating the crucial people side of the business of healthcare. Subscribe now for a weekly dose of Culture Change RX. Now let's dive into this week's conversation where culture change takes center stage. Welcome to another episode of Culture Change RX. And this is one of those episodes where I have the great joy of having a guest in the studio today. And as usual, when we have a guest, we have them introduce themselves and then we'll get right into the conversation.
Thank you. So my name is Carol Breen, and I am currently a human resources total rewards consultant. My background goes all the way back to when I was a nurse. So I've been in nursing management, got my MBA, and then kind of crossed over into consulting and have been doing that for the last, we won't say how many years. Because of my background in healthcare, I've done a lot of work in the healthcare arena. So any, things as specific as nursing clinical ladders and creating nursing structures. I've also worked in a variety of industries and not-for-profits. And my focus has primarily been compensation, total rewards, but I've always kind of had that touch with kind of performance management and with managing people as well in OD, just because of my background. I did get my MBA, by the way. I put in a plug for the University of Michigan.
And I'm from Michigan, and my master's is from the University of Minnesota, which we call the other U of it.
Yeah, would be.
So, part of the story here of our being together on a podcast, it goes back to what seems like a lifetime ago when years ago, the healthcare organization that I worked for as an executive, we engaged you. I was the chief nursing officer at the time, and we engaged you to come and help us with our compensation program. And we had one, but it had gotten really messy and we needed to clean that up, shore that up. And you were just so amazing in that work with us. And I have to say that one of the things that I remember most about the work of putting together a compensation program, a brand new one for our organization, was when we were just working on, for instance, the piece about leadership. I remember thinking that I thought it was going to be pretty cut and dry about how we approached, leaders, and this is pay grades for them. But it turned into a conversation about what do different type of leaders do and what titles do we use for them? Because again, just like our compensation package had gotten messy, or program had gotten messy, our titling and our job description and job duties and all these different things, we had so many and it was a mess. And before we could even develop a compensation program, we had to clean up this other mess. And I didn't think we were opening that can of worms, Carol.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is bigger than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I do that a lot with my projects. I'm often brought in when an organization has had a compensation program and it's been kind of moving along, maybe not maintained the way it should be. And
that was our story.
All of a sudden, it's kind of time for a change and to revisit. And titling is an interesting thing. There was one project that I did with a client, and they were an organization that were an acquirer. They kept acquiring organizations. And so they had all of these different organizations, many of whom were organized. So you had also to deal with union issues related to titling. And they were trying to consolidate their titling across the organization. And, it causes all kinds of conversations, especially to your point, when you're talking about leaders. And, an organization will have a title, but what that leader is doing can differ across different parts of the organization. A supervisor is maybe not really a supervisor. Maybe it's more like a manager. And sometimes managers are really more like supervisors.
Yeah, yeah. No, I remember that whole can getting open, and we were like, oh boy, we have got some work to do, and put some thought behind this, because we just you're going so fast sometimes to just do the day-to-day work, that you got to stop and pause and clean up some of this for good reason, for really good reason. I know in our work with Capstone Leadership Solutions, when we're working with an entire organization, we really group the leaders in two buckets: senior leaders and frontline leaders. We call them all leaders. Because we're working, again, like right now, we're working with 16 different organizations, and we can't even remember, do they call them directors or department managers or department heads or whatever? But yeah, but I don't want to go too much down that rabbit hole. But, you introduced yourself to say you're a total rewards consultant. I just love that phrase. I just love the concept that comes in my mind when you talk about that. And actually, I've seen and been part of your work and been close to your work over, many years now. But I know you have conceptual framework around compensation and pay and benefits and learning and development and work environment. That's really a beautiful framework for what you call total rewards. And I think it's beautiful. So I'd love you to explain that. I know that there's a document that describes this in more detail, and there's a lot of meat behind it, but I would love for you to talk about this concept of total rewards.
I will try to do that. So, anytime you have an employee and employer relationship, there's this transaction, this deal that's going on between both parties. And a lot of times, organizations and people will focus on a particular aspect of that arrangement. And one that people frequently talk about is pay. And so this total rewards concept has 4 quadrants. The upper 2 quadrants I refer to as transactional in nature. In the upper left quadrant, which is where I spend a lot of my time, is compensation or pay.
Mm-hmm.
The right quadrant is related to benefits. So anything benefit goes into that bucket.
Mm-hmm.
And those 2 quadrants are called transactional because it's easy to compare them. You can put a dollar figure to them. You can compare where you are relative to other organizations. And it's relatively simple from a cost perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Lower 2 quadrants are called more relational quadrants. And good reason for that. So the lower left quadrant is called the learning and development quadrant. And that's the quadrant that has to do with me, the individual employee. What are my career options? What kind of support are you giving me to do my job? What kind of mentoring? What are the career paths that I may have open to me? All of those kinds of things. And then on the lower right quadrant is the organizational quadrant, which really is looking at the arena that Capstone really focuses on, which is the organization itself. And it's the culture, it's the mission. Am I proud to be part of this organization? What are the senior leaders like? What is the messaging that they're sending? How do they treat employees? And then there's another part of that quadrant, which is my team. So this quadrant is pretty complex from my perspective. How does my team treat me? Am I a respected member? And that same concept applies from the leadership perspective. Am I treated respectfully? Am I heard? Am I listened to? And also kind of falling into there is that whole work-life integration. So the lower two quadrants really affect kind of my day-to-day experience of work. And you can't put a dollar figure on them. And yet they are critical to why people come to organizations and why they stay at organizations. And so one of the things that I've done with clients is to help them walk through an assessment process. One way to do it is, if you want to do a deep dive, is you can look at your leaders. You can, to your point, kind of segment it so that you're looking at your senior leadership, so your frontline leaders and staff. And, I have a questionnaire that uses numbers and ratings. So you could get a sense of people's perception about how the organization is doing in each of these quadrants. And when you combine and compare the results, it's an excellent way to look at where is their alignment, where are the gaps, and it helps to create a way to go forward. The one thing that we were talking about earlier is that when people leave organizations, it's so easy to point to that upper left quadrant and say, it's the pay. I'm leaving for the pay. I'm getting a better opportunity someplace else. But really, people are leaving because of the lower quadrants. They're leaving because they either don't feel supported, they don't feel like they have the opportunities that they're looking for, or they feel like the organization and its leadership are letting them down. It could be a toxic culture. So it's an interesting framework to get the dialogue started.
It's a great framework for that. Like I'm a framework person anyway. I love to take big ideas and chunk them down into relatable and understandable segments so that you can actually do something with them, right? It seems a little overwhelming otherwise. I mean, each one of these quadrants is big in and of
Yeah.
themselves. And then collectively, the total, it really, to me, gives a big picture of total rewards. I just love that phrase.
The work environment has just, over, I guess, the past few years, gotten even more complex. And so this kind of puts it into perspective and helps identify opportunities really for organizations to where they could do better. Sometimes with pay, it's not that organizations aren't paying appropriately, but a lot of times they're not communicating it well.
That is true. I've seen that happen a fair bit because pay and benefits are, and some of these other areas too, are questions, common questions on annual employee surveys. And we look at a lot of that data and we trend a lot of that data. And so, yeah, pay and benefits come up there, but all those other things do too on that survey, and start to see the data around all of these points. And like, I'm a believer too, even though my work is bottom quadrants, in particular, those relational rewards and how organizations really amp up and optimize those parts of their organization as, a really healthcare is a people driven business, right? It's people taking care of people. So we've got to get this right. But I really do also really support very fair pay that's internal and external equity and great benefits. Like I want that for healthcare workers. Like I'm an and person. Like all these quadrants, I want all these quadrants strong, like all of them.
And I think, if you are a strong organization, you try to deliver on all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're having challenges, the thing to do is to communicate that. For example, when it comes to pay, sometimes it's a matter of understanding. Organizations typically benchmark themselves to what they perceive to be the market.
Mm-hmm.
The market is not one shoe size fits all.
No.
And in today's world where, people can sometimes, depending on the job, work remotely, so many other factors come into play. And so who is the appropriate marketplace is a big question.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point earlier about pay and benefit is sometimes it's just a misperception that it's not equitable or somehow not the best it could be. I know that like when sometimes one of our partner healthcare organizations, they see those low scores on their surveys, maybe from employees, and then they just do a lot of education about their internal and their external equity. They don't even change it. They just educate on it. They share, the concepts behind it. They share maybe about the benefits. They don't even know maybe the value of many of the benefits they have. And without changing anything, when they resurvey, they find that their employees are more satisfied with those transactional rewards just because they now have a deeper understanding of the value of them. And they didn't understand that before.
Well, what's interesting is when I've done this work and done focus groups, one of the things that can happen is if you have an employee population where you have a certain segment who have been there forever, that is their only lived work experience. And so they don't have other points of reference. And so they may be working at the best place ever, and they don't know it because they don't know what other places are like. And so sometimes it's when you get in some new employees or people leave and come back, you get different perspectives on kind of what the organization is actually doing for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think too is like one of the recent things I see a fair bit of interesting dynamics inside of healthcare organizations is how many have had to use travelers or per diem staff in follow up to kind of the mass exit during the pandemic or post pandemic. And then we've got this equity issue, just like on a nursing unit where you've got these senior people, you got these new people, and then you've got these outside people. And that starts to complicate things too when we've got those kind of dynamics going on.
Exactly. And I've worked with organizations, who were heavily traveler dependent. And, they kind of came around to the thinking of, we're paying so much money. They started to switch their focus on, can we come up with a PRN pool or some kind of a pool so that we're getting people who are here and kind of giving them a larger piece of the pie and addressing kind of that equity issue, which is kind of the big elephant in.
Yeah, and that dynamic starts to impact those bottom quadrants, right? Those relational
Yeah,
rewards, and especially that organizational component is when you introduce that element of two different tiers or two different levels, employed versus not employed, committed versus seemingly not committed, although I know some pretty amazing traveler groups
right.
out there. It's not painting everyone with the same brush, but it introduces an element to your culture and to your team. When you mentioned team in that right bottom quadrant in the relational corner, there's one other thing that I'm looking at a document that our audience obviously cannot see, and it's these four quadrants of your total rewards right in the middle. And, you created this document, so you had a reason why you did this. Right in the middle is a big yellow box that says recognition. Why do you have that there?
I have it there because I think recognition is a critical element to attracting and keeping people because
Mm.
people want to feel like they're valued. And I think there's the potential in each of those quadrants to recognize employees from a different perspective. But I think there's also this overarching necessity to, on an ongoing basis, make people feel like they're valued. And I think you do that through formal and informal recognition systems and through all of the quadrants. So I think it's the centerpiece. From my perspective, employees want to do a good job. Years ago, I worked in the area of quality. And one of the things that we used to talk about is, people don't come into work every day and say, gee, I wonder how I can screw up today. That's not the mindset for people. People are there to do a good job. And what you want to do is to support them. And recognition comes in various forms, but it's
Mm-hmm.
so critical. because if somebody does not feel like what they're doing is of benefit, it kind of demeans how they're feeling about what they're doing.
And I mean, you probably know examples of this, but I'm just thinking of it too. Is like, I know some people with some very high pay, with some very great benefits, but they work in an environment where that other form of recognition and appreciation and feeling valued doesn't exist. And they could walk away. And it isn't for the pay or the benefits, it's because that part is missing. They are very dissatisfied.
One of the things that I think, from my perspective, is you have somebody who really wants to do a good job, who's committed and cares about the organization, and is not getting kind of going into that lower right quadrant, treated appropriately or recognized, and they're there and they're doing the job, but they, to your point, are not happy campers. And
Mhm.
that's not a good scenario for an organization to have those kind of employees. And, I have a friend who is a senior leader and she's kind of in that role. Her organization was acquired, and the acquiring organization is a very top down, nose to the grindstone, do it our way. There's no concept of boundaries. There's
Mhm.
no concept of time away.
Mhm.
And, how long does one choose to stay in that environment?
Yeah, yeah. I think you're seeing it and I'm seeing it. And your example kind of points to this is I think there's a new level of expectation for the kind of flexibility and work life integration and empowerment in a way. Like, I think there's a new sense of that in the workforce and demand or desire for it that's maybe more important, if we had to put them in order, than pay and benefits. Like, they'd almost like take less pay to have more of this, to have more of this.
There's
Yeah.
an organization that comes to my mind that had an image in the community of a place where people were very proud to be affiliated and proud to work.
Hmm.
Things changed, and the staff felt like they were not listened to. They were not heard. They were discounted. The focus was on production. The focus was not on taking care and giving quality care.
Hmm.
And they ended up organizing.
Yeah.
So, to your point, I think it's a different day out there. And I think that, employees also see where they have their voice. And if they feel like their voice is not being heard,
Hmm.
and quality care is not being safely delivered, they will go to other venues in order to do that because, getting back to it all, most employees are there because they love the work and they love taking
Hmm.
care of the patients.
Hmm. And some things like this can get in the way of them not feeling good about that work or that job that they have that allows them to do that work. And if we want to have a great healthcare organization with great people and be a magnet for talent and be able to recruit and retain them, and that's required to give the very best care, all four of these quadrants are the pathway there.
They totally are. And I think you can ignore, disregard them for a while, but at some point it comes back to bite you.
Hmm.
You can't get away with things forever.
Yeah, yeah. You might get a short little pass.
Yeah, exactly. But in the long term, the word's going to get out there on the street.
For sure. In our company, we primarily, as you know, work with small and rural healthcare organizations. And boy, the word gets around really quick, it seems, and it stays around a long time. It's hard to change it once it's out there. Like 30 years ago, this happened and it's still circulating as if it's true today. But yeah, it's certainly like as an employer and your reputation as one in the community. And we depend on that to recruit and get our next best employees is that reputation, either compels or deters people from filling out that application for that job that's available. And then it's our reputation in all four of these quadrants that make up that reputation in the community.
Exactly. When all organizations are looking to attract and keep kind of the best caliber of talent that they can. And so it's important that they look at what the potential employee wants and create an arrangement, a deal that makes them want to come, want to stay, and more importantly, want to stay connected and involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I know on employee surveys now, like even like some of the big vendors like Pressgania, they're switching over some of their macro measurements of employee engagement and satisfaction. And one of the areas where they're really surveying or focusing is on this sense of belonging. And that's really in that bottom right
It's
corner,
that
right?
bottom right corner, and it's about being connected, but it's also part of being in a team where people value each other and treat each other well. That is, I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you've been the employee and somebody in your team doesn't like you and doesn't treat you very well.
Oh, yeah.
Very challenging situation.
Yep. And I didn't want to stay. I did not want to stay. Nope. And I had a great job that I loved. I loved the work. I loved the pay. I loved the benefits. I loved everything else about it. But that one element of just that discord. And I think it was more than just the fact that there was discord there. It was that I didn't understand it and I couldn't figure out how to fix it or if it was even fixable. Like it was just so complexing to me. Like couldn't even believe it was part of my work life. And, I hear other people talk about similar things in their work experience. It's hard to be
Yeah.
working, 30, 40 years and not come across a situation in your work life where maybe that was the case. But yeah, that's right in that bottom
Yeah.
quadrant.
And I think to your point, anybody who's been working for more than a couple of years probably, unfortunately, has had that experience. And I think that falls to leadership
Yeah.
to have their eye on the ball and
Mm.
understand what's going on and kind of determine the best way forward as far as intervening, because there are some things that are not okay to be tolerated.
Yeah. Well, one time a whole nother scenario, I was on an executive team where me and one of the other executive team members just had a rub. It went kind of back before we were both on the executive team. And then we carried that into the executive team when we were working closer in a higher stake situation, higher pressure situation. Then it even got worse. Right. And our boss, to your point, our boss, the CEO was like, no, 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 because it affects everything, right? It affects the whole team, the functioning of the team. And he's like, no, no, no. And I mean, he demanded resolution to that. And we were able to, like today, I can't even remember what the problem was, but we did come to resolution and be able to work together. In fact, he's retired now, but if I were to see him in the community, we'd probably hug and catch
Yeah.
up. We like each other. We would have said we missed each other and we truly want to know that each other was doing well. But yeah, to your point, it was our boss that was like, I recognize this, and this dynamic is not good for all the people around you, not just the two of you, and it's got to end.
Exactly.
We got to find out the correction to this and fix it.
Yeah. Things have this ripple effect. And from my perspective, it's the role of the leader to not just to intervene, but to be aware that it's even happening. Because a lot
Yeah.
of times a leader can kind of be so sequestered from reality that they're not really seeing what's going on because they're focused on something else.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and to your quadrant about learning and development, I mean, that's a special skill set of leaders
Mhm.
that they may not have. Like when I was a nursing leader, if I had a nurse that was struggling in their clinical skills, where knowledge or skill set or experience was needed, I felt way more comfortable approaching that, addressing that, working with him or her towards that. It felt safer. It felt more appropriate for me as a nursing leader to do that. But then there's this whole other part about like all these social stuff, psychosocial stuff,
Right.
you know, behavioral things. And then you think, wait a minute, I'm not sure I'm equipped, you know, as a leader to know even what to do about that. The other is so much easier. You know, give me a
Right.
skill set deficit every day of the week, but give me a behavioral problem or relationship problem. And I'm like, I have not been trained for this.
Well, and I think that then kind of raises the issue of what resources do you have? So maybe I don't have the skill set to be able to handle it. However, within my organization, I need to find somebody
HR.
who can help me. Yeah, come on down.
Yeah. Actually, we used to use our employee assistance program, our
Right.
EAP counselors and psychologists. We used to have them come in with individual situations or whole department situations
Yeah,
because as a leader, we're like, yeah, I don't know how to navigate this,
exactly.
but yeah, we need
Yeah.
somebody here that has some experience and tools in
Well,
their toolkit.
yeah. And, we were talking, I think, earlier before the podcast of there's something to be said for having kind of a neutral person get involved in some situations, because they don't have any allegiance or alignments. And there's nothing in it for them to, they don't need to game the system. There needs to be kind of an open minded, honest way to resolve the issue.
Yeah. And that can be so helpful. In fact, you and I both know we've both been called to serve in that role sometimes. And actually, when you're asked to serve in that role, it does take that emotional piece out of it or those biases sometimes. And actually, it's very purposeful and meaningful, and it's not as emotionally charged for you. Where if you're doing it yourself in your own situation as a leader or me and my company, it's got a different, I can do it. It's the same process for doing it, but it's charged a little differently.
Yeah. When you're in the weeds and you're emotionally connected, it's a
Mm.
very different process, and you look at things through a different lens. And sometimes it's not the best one to be using to resolve the issue.
Yeah, yeah. But we are people, we are humans, and we are complicated little animals, aren't we? In
We
individuals and
definitely
in
are.
herds, an entire team or department or organization, and it can get complicated. I always ask my guests at the end, as they anticipate a conversation like this, they might really want to have this platform to share a specific message or word of wisdom or something. And there might have been something like that we already covered. But if there was anything like that we want to make sure gets recorded into today's episode, I'll give you the floor to be able to do that. And if not, we'll move into, we want to connect you to people. So I also want to make sure we do that here at the end too. So
Thank
anything
you.
you wanted to add or share before we close out?
No, I think the only thing that I will say is I kind of unearthed the total rewards that we've been referring to the graphic, and I've not been using it for a while. And the whole conversation has kind of reminded me of why I created it in the first place. So, yeah. I think it's a
Yeah,
very
reconnect.
helpful way as an employer to really have a great approach to dealing with your employees.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't mind, we'll share it with our audience. We could put it in the show notes as a link and they could see this image we've been talking about. I think that might be helpful.
I think that would be great. I would love that.
Yeah. And how can people reach you, Carol, if their organization is in need of some of the things we talked about here today and they need that outside perspective and helpfulness that I know you're so good at because I have witnessed it firsthand and benefited firsthand. So, how
You
can
are
they
too
reach
kind.
you?
They can either email or call me. Email is carolbreen@sedonapartners.com.
And we'll put that in the show notes too. So,
And then my
okay,
phone number, which I assume you'll put in the show notes as well.
we will. Mm-hmm.
Those are the
Yeah.
best two ways to reach out to me.
Yeah. And I know that your background as a nurse and a lot of the work you've done has been in healthcare, but I'm just delighted that you're also, working in those other industries. And maybe we have some followers from some other industries for the podcast, since a lot of what we talk about here applies to any workplace culture and the people related dynamics of a business. So Yeah, well, we will put your contact information there. We will put this total rewards diagram in there so they can see these 4 quadrants and check it all out. And thank you so much, Carol. It's so nice to have you as a guest today. And I look forward to us staying connected. And I wish you well.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you.
Thanks for tuning in to Culture Change RX. If you found value in today's episode and you are a believer in fostering change in healthcare, join us in making a difference. Follow, rate, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. Share it with colleagues and your network. Together, we can make a lasting impact. Until next week, keep inspiring positive change.